As Jesus walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. It was so that God's works might be revealed in him." Who sinned to make this man blind? Whose fault is it? We still think like this, don't we? If suffering is a punishment for sin, someone must have sinned, or this man would not have been born blind. That is the disciples' assumption, and we still think this way. When something goes wrong, it is someone's fault. Haven't you ever caught yourself thinking, if he ate better, he wouldn't have diabetes? Or, if he were not so angry all the time, he would not have gotten cancer. Or worse and more to the point, if she took better care of herself, her baby would not have been born with all those problems. The disciples are just reflecting the beliefs of their culture and times. If a baby is born blind, it must be a punishment for sin, so either the parents sinned or somehow the baby itself, maybe somehow in the womb, has managed to sin. It is human nature to look for cause and fault when something goes wrong. Just look at the news today. In between the reports of the coronavirus spreading, there are reports about how the Trump administration has messed it all up and just made things worse. And if you go to the conservative news outlets, you will find reports about how the Democrats are using this as a weapon to attack Trump. Whose fault is it? Who is to blame? Jesus says that's the wrong question. No one sinned. It was so that God's works might be revealed. Jesus shifts the conversation from cause to purpose, from fault to mission. Instead of seeking the cause or fault, Jesus teaches us to look at the purpose or mission that is called forth in any given situation. If we stop trying to assign blame and look instead at purpose, we see that the man born blind has a mission. He starts out as a blind beggar, sitting at the side of the road, and Jesus makes mud, makes clay, and puts it on his eyes, and tells him to go wash in the pool of Siloam. When he returns with his sight restored and his neighbors question him, he says, a man called Jesus restored his vision. They press him to explain who is this Jesus and how he restored vision to a man born blind. And he declares he is a prophet. The Pharisees challenged the man and Jesus, offended that the healing was done on the Sabbath. And he says, he is from God. And then, incredibly, this beggar begins to lecture the religious authorities for their own blindness, their failure to see the love of God at work. And then, when the Jewish authorities throw him out, Jesus comes to him, and the man sees Jesus and worships him. He is a witness to the presence and love of God. The man born blind has a mission, and each of us have a mission. We all share a purpose to let God's love shine into the world. Together, we have a mission to be Christ for the world. But each of us have our own individual expression of that mission as well. And each of us have gifts and limitations. and those affect our mission and the expression of that mission. The man was not born blind as a punishment for sin. He was not struck with blindness to make a point. He was born a child of God, like each of us, with particular gifts and limitations. One of his limitations was that he was born blind. One of his gifts was to be a witness to the love of God. God uses the man and his blindness and his healing to show us how to be in relationship with God and with one another. As I was working on this sermon about a man born blind who was given his sight, I realized that we have someone in our own congregation for whom that is the story of her life. Anne Prather. She was born blind. At the age of 3, her parents and the doctors figured out that she had no vision at all. And then at the age of 6, they did a procedure that restored her sight to her. It restored the function of her eyes to her. So I called Anne this week and I asked her about her experience of having her sight returned to her as an older person after having been born blind. And we had a fascinating conversation. It's a great story, and Anne has given me permission to talk about it here with you today. Anne was, as I said, diagnosed as blind or seen to be completely blind by the age of 3 months. And it wasn't until she was 6 years old that they did this procedure. And her eyes were returned to function, but that did not give her her sight. It only restored the function of her eyes themselves, because sight is something that happens in the brain. And her brain had to learn to interpret the images and the signals that her eyes were now, once again, or for the first time in her case, sending to her brain. So, at the age of 6, when her eyes were restored, she had to learn to see. The first thing that she saw was light. Then, she saw color. After a while of seeing light and color, she began to be able to perceive shapes. And then she had to learn what those shapes mean. And Anne has a poetic bent to her. She called this part of her learning the song of generations. It's a beautiful idea that she had to learn to sort and distinguish and categorize. She had to see shapes and categorize them and learn their relationships, the relationship between one shape and another. She had to learn that there are plants and leaves, and then there are different kinds of plants with different shapes of leaves. There are flowers and bushes and trees, and there are people. And people have children and parents, and they look alike. There's a discernible relationship between them. The generations of living things evolve in beautiful and recognizable ways. That's the song of generations. As Anne was describing this progression from light to color to shape to meaning, I realized that her experience of gaining sight is like that of the man born blind in our story today. He goes from seeing to knowing to understanding and finally to loving. Light, color, shape, and the song of generations. Light, a first awareness of the divine. First, the man knows only that a man named Jesus put mud on his eyes, told him to wash, and when he returned, he could see. Color. In a growing relationship and appreciation for the sacred, the man recognizes and proclaims Jesus as a prophet. Shape. The man is learning to see Christ and to see Christ in others. And as his knowledge and understanding grow, and he confidently declares, Jesus is from God. And then the song of generations. Finally, the man sees Jesus personally, loves him, and worships him. That's the pattern of seeing God. That is the spiritual path that Anne traveled as she learned to see. That is the path that the man born blind walks as he comes to know Jesus. This spiritual path starts when we move from cause to purpose, from blame to mission, from blaming to serving. If we can move in this coronavirus pandemic from blame to mission, we can learn to see in a new way. We can go from begging on the side of the road to witnessing the divine. Light, color, shape, and the song of generations. Light, color, shape, and participating in God's love and purpose. Light, where do you see the sacred? It is still here. The sacred is present here, even now. Color. How are we called to serve? We all have to observe the rules of social distancing. We want to protect the most vulnerable among us. And we can still find ways to serve, to bless, to connect, to reassure. Shape. How can our shared gifts make a difference even now? In this epidemic, as we are isolated from one another. We all have gifts and limitations. Our limitations right now include isolation from one another. How can we turn our gifts and even this isolation into blessing? Each of us in this congregation have been assigned to a care group. Call your care group. Call them. Text or email the other people in your group. Reach out. Get to know them. Create new connection and relationship. If you didn't receive an email inviting you to be a part of a care group, call us or email us and we'll put you in one. And finally, the song of generations, love, participating in the presence of the divine. God is present in us, among us, and through us for the world as we navigate our communal and individual response to this situation. You have a purpose. You have a mission to love God and to love your neighbor.